Welcome to True Echo, the channel where untold truths, powerful moments, and human resilience come to life. Today's story begins at a somber memorial, but within just 60 seconds, a mysterious young man turns the entire service, and a family legacy, on its head. What he reveals with one haunting melody will leave everyone breathless. This is more than just music. It's a confession, a reckoning, and a second chance. You need to stop him. He has no right to touch that piano. The whisper cut through the quiet tension in the Ellison Memorial Chapel like a cold wind. Every neck turned in time to see the source of the rising ripple, a young man in his late 20s, striding slowly down the aisle, toward the grand piano near the altar. His blazer was threadbare, his expression unreadable. He moved not like a man crashing a service, but like someone walking into his own reckoning. The pianist, an older gentleman prepared to play the final hymn, looked stunned as the young man leaned down and whispered something to him. Then, shocking everyone, he simply nodded and stepped aside. Margaret Ellison, widow of Robert Ellison, the man whose life was being honored, glanced at her son Daniel with alarm. Daniel, tall and tightly coiled in a black suit, clenched his jaw. He started to rise but was too late. The stranger sat down at the bench. The entire room held its breath. He didn't launch into a grand overture. Instead, he hovered over the keys for an eternal beat, hands trembling but reverent, as if he were about to disturb a ghost. And then, he played. It wasn't a hymn. It wasn't anything anyone recognized. But within seconds, the melody wove itself into the bones of every person in the chapel. It was mournful, raw, and ancient in its sadness. It was a story told in notes, unfiltered by words or expectations. Margaret's hand flew to her chest, her face frozen in disbelief. Even the choir boys stilled. As the final note lingered, barely audible, almost holy, the stranger spoke. "My name is Joshua." A wave of murmurs spread through the chapel. Margaret stiffened. Daniel stood fully now. "You need to leave. Now." But Margaret lifted her hand, stopping him. "I know many of you are wondering who I am," Joshua continued, voice shaking. "And why I came here. I didn't come to make demands. I came because I had to play that song. For him. For me. For the truth." Daniel's face turned crimson. "You think you can just interrupt my father's memorial and call yourself part of our story?" Joshua met his eyes. No rage. Only something hollow and enduring. "Robert Ellison was my father." Gasps shot through the room like a shockwave. Margaret's lips parted. She didn't breathe. Somewhere in the back, a distant relative muttered, "I remember. He disappeared once. Came back different. Quiet." "I know I don't look like I belong," Joshua said. "But that song. He gave it to my mother before I was born. On a cassette. I listened to it every birthday. He never visited again. But that melody, he meant for me to hear it." Margaret's voice was a whisper. "I recognized it. He hummed it the night after our engagement. I asked what it was. He said it wasn't finished yet." Joshua looked down. "He finished it. Just not with you." The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that grows sharp, tight in the chest, cold in the bones. Joshua's words hung there, thick and unreal, as if even the walls of the chapel didn't quite believe what they'd heard. Margaret remained frozen in her seat, her fingers gripping the edge of the pew like it was the only thing tethering her to the earth. Daniel stood, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles looked carved from stone. Around them, friends, colleagues, even distant family fidgeted and whispered, caught between disbelief and morbid curiosity. "I didn't come for an inheritance," Joshua said softly, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "I didn't even come for acknowledgement. I just came to play what he left me. Because I thought, maybe, deep down, he wanted it to be heard one day. Even if he never said it." A dry, bitter scoff escaped Daniel's lips. So what? He sneaks off, leaves some mystery tape with your mother, and suddenly you show up at his funeral playing his final masterpiece. Joshua didn't flinch. It's not a masterpiece. It's not even complete. It's grief. It's regret. It's love that didn't have the right place to grow. Margaret rose now, slowly, carefully, as though her body was as fragile as her heart. She walked down the aisle, each step deliberate. The room parted for her, giving her space like the matriarch she had always been, but now carried something different, the tremble of a woman who had just met a ghost of her husband's life. When she reached Joshua, she didn't look angry. She looked tired. Heartbroken. Curious. You said he gave you a cassette. Joshua nodded. He told my mother to give it to me when I was old enough to understand. I've never played it for anyone. Not until today. She reached into her purse and pulled out a yellowed sheet of folded paper. I found this a week before he died, she whispered. I thought it was just another draft of something he never finished. But now. She handed it to Joshua. His hands trembled as he unfolded it. There, in Robert's careful handwriting, was the title. For the boy I'll never hold. His breath caught. He looked up, barely able to speak. This was mine. The pews were deathly still. Even the children sensed they were witnessing something they couldn't explain but would never forget. Daniel finally spoke again, this time quieter. You say you're not here for money. Then what? What do you want? Joshua looked at him and, for the first time, something softer passed between them, still laced with tension, but no longer edged with threat. I wanted to return what he left me, Joshua said. Not the song. The silence. And maybe by playing it, someone would finally hear what he couldn't say. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. When he stopped playing piano. I thought it was because he was tired. Or because he'd outgrown it. But now I wonder, maybe he stopped because he gave it away. Joshua's voice cracked. He didn't give it away. He gave it a place to hide. He turned to leave then, having said more than he ever meant to. But as he reached the chapel doors, Margaret called out. Wait. He turned, unsure whether to run or brace for a slap. But she stepped toward him and extended a hand. If he gave you a piece of himself, she said softly, then whether we knew about you or not, you are a piece of him. Come back to the house. Daniel's head whipped toward her, but Margaret didn't back down. I'm not asking for permission, she told her son. I'm inviting truth to dinner. Joshua hesitated, stunned. He didn't know if it was a trick, a test, or something else entirely. But when he looked into Margaret's face, he saw none of the cold elegance she had always been known for. He saw pain. And strength. And a woman trying to salvage what remained of the truth. He gave a small, uncertain nod. I'll come, he said. If only to thank you. For listening. Margaret stepped aside and linked her arm gently with his, a quiet, dignified gesture that said more than words ever could. And Daniel, still rooted to the aisle, watched them go, his father's shadow suddenly larger, more complicated than ever. The family had gathered to bury Robert Ellison. But they were leaving the chapel with something entirely different, a melody reborn, a legacy fractured, and a son no one expected, whose presence was about to rewrite everything. The Ellison estate sat perched like a silent witness above the town, a stately mansion built of stone, symmetry, and legacy. For decades, it had been the physical embodiment of Robert Ellison's status, powerful, pristine, and impenetrable. But that evening, as Margaret's car wound up the curved driveway with Joshua seated silently in the back, the house felt different. Less imposing. Less sure of itself. Daniel had driven separately, saying little as he peeled out of the chapel parking lot. No one stopped him. Joshua, on the other hand, sat in the back seat like a man being delivered to trial. He clutched the sheet music Margaret had given him, his eyes scanning the lines over and over again. For the boy I'll never hold. Just reading it made his hands tremble. It felt like a key to a house he had never been allowed to enter, a song written in a language only he and Robert shared, even if they never spoke face to face as men. Margaret didn't speak much during the drive either, though her eyes occasionally flicked toward the rearview mirror to glance at him. She looked tired, exhausted, really, but composed in the way women like her had trained themselves to be, grief tucked behind posture, confusion hidden behind etiquette. When they reached the front doors, Margaret opened them herself. "Come in," she said, her voice less formal now, as if she wasn't inviting him into a house, but into the aftermath of a truth she hadn't been ready to hear. "You're welcome here. For tonight, at least." Joshua stepped inside. He'd imagined this moment 100 different ways growing up. The marble foyer. The massive chandelier. The smell of lemon polish and old wood. He used to think walking through this door would feel like winning something. But now that he was here, it felt like stepping into someone else's unfinished novel. The walls were lined with family portraits, Robert standing proud with Margaret and their children, Daniel always in the center. Stiff suits. Forced smiles. Not one photograph included music. Or joy. Joshua paused in front of a photo from the late 90s. Robert looked younger, his smile more relaxed than the others. Margaret noticed. That was taken the same year he stopped playing. Joshua nodded, his eyes still on the photo. That's the year he visited my mother. Just once. She inhaled sharply. Did he ever hold you? Joshua shook his head. He sat with me. Said I had his eyes. Then left a tape and told her to give it to me someday. He never came back. Margaret's gaze dropped. I always wondered why he started sleeping in the study. Joshua blinked. He did. For years, she whispered. He said it was work stress. But sometimes, I'd hear the piano keys late at night. Just a few notes. Then nothing. I didn't know they were for you. He said nothing. They walked further in. In the parlor, an old upright piano sat against the far wall. It wasn't polished like the one at the memorial, it was scuffed, the edges worn, one pedal slightly crooked. But when Joshua approached, his hand resting lightly on the lid, something in him shifted. This was his, Margaret said. Joshua sat on the bench. He didn't play. Not yet. He just placed his fingers lightly on the keys. Daniel appeared in the doorway. Still here, he said flatly. Guess that wasn't just a stunt. Joshua looked up, but didn't rise. I didn't come to stunt. Daniel folded his arms. Right. You came to play the song of the century and crack the family like an egg. Well done. Daniel, Margaret said quietly. No, he snapped. He shows up out of nowhere, hijacks the memorial, and we're just supposed to make space for him at dinner. No one said this was easy, Joshua replied. Least of all me. Daniel stepped closer. So what do you want? An apology? A slice of the inheritance? The family crest? Joshua's voice stayed even. I want nothing. I never wanted anything. I just wanted the song to be heard. That's it. Daniel stared at him for a long moment. Something in his posture softened. He really wrote it for you? Joshua nodded. He didn't know how to say it out loud. So he said it the only way he knew how. Silence. Margaret looked between them. Then walked to a nearby shelf and pulled down a leather journal. I think he tried, she said. He used to write things when he couldn't say them. You should see this. She handed it to Joshua. He opened it carefully. On the first page, in Robert's looping script. I sent him the music. Maybe he'll understand what I couldn't say. Joshua swallowed hard. His vision blurred. Daniel looked over his shoulder. He wrote that. Joshua nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Something shifted in Daniel's eyes. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But understanding. Margaret's voice broke the stillness. He never knew how to be fully present. Not even with us. He split his life between obligation and, what, Joshua? What did he say to your mother? Joshua looked down. That he couldn't stay. That he wasn't allowed to stay. Margaret closed her eyes. That sounds like him. Daniel looked at them both, his arms dropping to his sides. So what now? He's gone. You're here. Do we just rewrite the story? Joshua finally stood from the piano bench. We don't rewrite it, he said. We finish it. And for the first time that night, Daniel didn't have a rebuttal. He simply nodded. Not in agreement. But in recognition. The dining room that evening was unlike any other dinner that had ever occurred under the Ellison roof. There was no silverware polished to perfection, no crystal glasses sparkling beneath chandeliers, no strict seating arrangements echoing formality. Instead, there were 3 place settings, a single pitcher of water, and silence broken only by the occasional clink of a fork against porcelain. Joshua sat across from Daniel, the table stretching between them like a symbolic no-man's land. Margaret sat at the head, her posture upright, composed, but this time, not guarded. She didn't seem to be hosting. She seemed to be holding something together. Roast chicken. Herbed potatoes. Steamed greens. A modest meal in a house known for extravagant dinners with political guests and foundation board members. But the food wasn't the center tonight. The table was a stage. And all 3 of them were holding lines they hadn't yet rehearsed. Margaret was the first to speak. Tell me about your mother. Joshua blinked, surprised by the gentleness in the question. She was quiet, he said. Strong. Not in the loud way. In the way she held everything together and made it seem easy even when it wasn't. She was alone. But she never acted like it. She just kept going. Margaret nodded slowly. She never married. No, Joshua said. She said her great mistake and her great love were the same man. And she only needed that once. Daniel lowered his gaze to his plate. Joshua caught it, guilt maybe, or confusion. He couldn't tell. But the armor Daniel wore at the chapel had thinned considerably. That much was clear. Margaret took a small sip of water and placed the glass down deliberately. Did he ever try to come back? No, Joshua said. But she said he did call her once. When I was 12. Just once. She told him not to come. She was afraid of what it would do to him. To us. Daniel exhaled audibly. So he chose silence. Joshua met his eyes. Or maybe he didn't have a choice. Daniel leaned back. He always had a choice. Margaret didn't correct either of them. She stared down at the tablecloth, fingers lightly brushing over the stitching like she was trying to trace her way back through time. He used to hum at night, she said softly. After dinner. After the kids were asleep. I'd ask him what it was. He'd always say, just a tune I never got to finish. Joshua's throat tightened. He did finish it. Just not out loud. No one spoke for a while after that. Not because they had nothing left to say, but because they were still trying to understand what it meant to have said so much in so short a time. After dinner, Margaret rose and gently placed a hand on Joshua's shoulder. There's something else I want you to see. She disappeared for a moment and returned with a wooden box, engraved with the initials R.E. Inside were scattered items, old cufflinks, a vintage lighter, a pearl tie pin, and beneath them all, a photo. It was weathered, its edges curled. A young woman, unmistakably Joshua's mother, smiling shyly at the camera. In her arms, a baby with a round face and bright, searching eyes. The back of the photo had a single line in Robert's handwriting. Year 1. God help me. Joshua didn't move. His breath hitched audibly. Daniel stood slowly and walked over. He looked down at the photo, then at Joshua. He kept this, he said, almost to himself. Joshua only nodded. Daniel stepped back. I hated you today, he said, voice even, measured. Joshua's eyes lifted to meet his. I know. Daniel folded his arms across his chest. I still don't know what I feel now. But it's not hate. Joshua looked down at the photo again. I don't need anything from you. Or the family. Or the estate. I just wanted the song to be heard. Once. Daniel stared at him for a long moment. Then extended his hand. Not warm. Not fully open. But extended. Joshua looked at it. And took it. The handshake was tentative. Fragile. But it held. Margaret watched them both, her eyes glistening with something old and buried that had finally surfaced, not relief, but peace. Later that evening, Margaret asked Joshua to play the song once more. He sat at the upright piano again, not to prove anything. Not to mourn. But to return what had always belonged to this house, even if it had never been invited in. And this time, when the first note floated into the air, it wasn't lonely. It was home. The morning sun poured through the Ellison estate's tall windows in thick, golden bands. The air smelled faintly of fresh linen and the lingering scent of roasted rosemary from the night before. Joshua awoke in the guest room, sheets tucked tight around him, the kind of bed made with care, not just for show. For a fleeting moment, it felt like he belonged, like the walls didn't remember he was a ghost. He sat on the edge of the bed, hands clasped, staring at the folded sheet music on the nightstand. The melody still hummed in his mind, like a gentle whisper not quite finished. Downstairs, he found Margaret seated in the sunroom, a cup of tea resting in her hands. She was staring at an old photo, one Joshua hadn't seen the night before. It was Robert, but younger, before the crisp suits and polished shoes, before the legacy weighed down his spine. His smile was wild, untamed, real. He looked happy, Joshua said gently as he entered. Margaret nodded. He was. Before the firm. Before the name became more important than the man. She didn't look up. You remind me of that version of him. Joshua sat beside her, unsure what to say. He used to laugh more, she said. Before everything became about image. About maintaining control. Somewhere along the way, he became someone we lived with, not someone we knew. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the ticking of the old grandfather clock and the distant chirping of birds in the garden. Do you regret him? Joshua asked finally. Margaret turned her face toward him, studied him like he was a puzzle she hadn't finished yet. No, she said, I regret that I didn't ask more questions. That I didn't listen harder to the silences. Joshua nodded slowly. Later that afternoon, Daniel offered to drive him back into the city. The ride was quiet at first, the road slipping past in a blur of trees and fences and winding hills. But there was something different about the silence now. It wasn't brittle or sharp. It had softened into something that made room for thought. Do you remember the first time you saw him? Daniel asked, eyes on the road. Joshua shook his head. Not clearly. I remember his hands. He kept adjusting his watch like he wasn't used to staying still. My mom said he was always in motion. Daniel chuckled faintly. He did that in court, too. Said it helped him think. More silence. Comfortable this time. Then Daniel spoke again. He ever say anything to you? Anything real? Joshua thought for a moment. He said, you'll never be alone. Not really. Then he left. Daniel's grip on the wheel tightened. He said something like that to me once. After I won my first trial. He said, "You carry my name now. Don't drop it." Joshua looked over. "That's not the same." "I know," Daniel said. "It isn't." When they pulled up outside Joshua's modest apartment, a red brick building with ivy curling up the side, Daniel parked and turned off the engine, but didn't move. "I didn't think this would matter," he said. "I thought you'd play the song, stir up some grief, then vanish." "I thought I would, too," Joshua admitted. Daniel nodded, then reached into the glove box and pulled out an envelope. "I found this. I wasn't sure if I should give it to you." He handed it over. On the front, in Robert's handwriting. Joshua. No last name. Just that. Joshua opened it carefully. Inside was a single typed page. The letter read. Joshua. I've lived a life split between what I was supposed to do and what I wished I'd done. You are the consequence of a single choice, and the miracle of it. If you're reading this, then you found the music. Which means you found the part of me I left behind. Forgive my silence. It was never rejection, only protection. You were not forgotten. You were never unloved. Play your own song. Loudly. Proudly. And know you are mine. Robert. Joshua folded the letter slowly, his hands trembling. He didn't cry, not yet, but something inside cracked open and filled with warmth. You know, he said quietly, I used to dream of letters like that. I just never imagined he actually wrote one. Daniel stared out the windshield. He wrote a lot of things he never sent. I guess he didn't know how to end them. Maybe that's why he loved music, Joshua replied. You don't have to explain the ending. You just play the last note. Daniel chuckled. That's surprisingly poetic for a guy who showed up uninvited to a funeral. Joshua laughed. I'll take that as progress. Daniel extended his hand again, not in formality this time, but in something more honest. See you next Sunday. Joshua grinned. Yeah. You will. As he stepped out, letter clutched tight, Joshua paused on the stairs and turned. Hey, Daniel. Yeah. I think we should record it. The song. Daniel raised an eyebrow. The one from the memorial? Joshua nodded. Not for anyone else. Just for us. For him. Daniel thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. We'll need a good mic. Joshua smiled. I know a guy. The studio wasn't glamorous. Tucked between a bookstore and a laundromat on the city's east side, it had no sign, just a faded green door and the faint sound of a piano scale bleeding through the brick walls like a memory trying to escape. Joshua had passed it 100 times. Always telling himself, someday. Today was someday. Daniel pulled up in a sleek sedan far too polished for this neighborhood. When he stepped out, dressed down in jeans and a plain sweater, he looked almost unrecognizable. For a moment, he stood outside the door like it might judge him. Then he looked at Joshua, nodded, and they went in together. Inside, the studio smelled of wood polish and worn-out dreams. Rugs frayed at the corners. A grand piano stood in the middle like an old friend waiting for a conversation. Ravi, the young engineer with dreadlocks and a soft demeanor, greeted Joshua with a wide grin. Yo, man. You're really gonna do it today? Joshua nodded. Yeah. This time, it's for real. Daniel raised an eyebrow. You've been here before. Joshua chuckled. A few times. Late nights. Played through the walls. Ravi glanced at Daniel. You know he wrote a melody once that made my girlfriend call her dad after 3 years of silence. No lyrics. Just chords. Daniel looked at Joshua with something between admiration and disbelief. You've really been hiding. Joshua shrugged. When you grow up in the shadows, you get used to keeping good things quiet. They set up slowly, mics, cables, lights dimmed to a warm amber glow. The piano's lid was lifted like a confession. The air carried weight. Joshua sat at the bench and ran his fingers across the keys. Not playing. Just feeling. From the booth, Ravi's voice came over the speaker. You ready? Joshua took a breath. I've been waiting my whole life. The red light blinked on. The first note was delicate. Not uncertain, deliberate. Every keystroke felt like unlocking something buried. This wasn't just a performance. It was a reclamation. Daniel watched from behind the glass, arms folded. His father's face flickered through his mind, not the polished, sharp-tongued litigator, but the man in the photo Margaret showed them. The younger Robert. The freer one. As the music grew, something shifted. Joshua wasn't just replaying the old melody. He was reshaping it. He wove in new chords. A fresh progression. A subtle shift in tempo. Where once the music ended in an aching, unfinished breath, it now rose into something fuller, richer, like a question finally answered. Daniel leaned closer. This wasn't the same song. Joshua was finishing it. And Daniel didn't feel erased. He felt included. When the last note rang and faded, Ravi's voice crackled through. We got it. Joshua's hands dropped gently into his lap. He didn't move for a moment. Then he rose, breathing hard, not from exertion, but from the release of years packed into melody. Daniel met him at the door. You changed it, he said. Joshua nodded. At the memorial, it felt like a message carved in stone, Daniel continued. Final. Untouchable. It was a message, Joshua said. But it wasn't the end. Daniel glanced back at the piano, then at his brother. What is it now? Joshua smiled faintly. A conversation. They didn't talk much on the drive back. But it wasn't awkward. It was filled with a kind of quiet reverence, two people who had stopped measuring the distance between them and started mapping a shared path forward. That evening, back at the Ellison estate, they played the recording for Margaret. She stood in the doorway of the study as the piano filled the room. Her husband's voice, soft, hidden within the chords, seemed to rise like mist from the speakers. As the final note hung in the air, she stepped forward, kissed each of them gently on the cheek, and whispered, Now it sounds like all three of you. Later that night, Joshua found Daniel sitting beneath the stars in the once manicured garden. You know, Daniel said, he never apologized. Not once. Joshua nodded. He didn't know how. Daniel looked at him. He wouldn't have said thank you, either. No, Joshua agreed. But maybe he would have stood beside us while we played. Maybe hummed along. Daniel smiled at that. That would have been enough. The wind stirred the leaves gently. The moonlight cast long shadows across the garden. For the first time, the Ellison house didn't feel like a monument. It felt like a home. Joshua closed his eyes, and for a second, he heard it again. A note in the dark. Not grief. Not silence. Just peace. A week later, the Ellison estate echoed with the gentle rhythm of restoration. The halls that once bore only silence now carried quiet footsteps, warm laughter, and, on certain afternoons, the delicate notes of a piano floating down the stairwell like an old song returning home. Joshua had become a regular presence, not a guest but something more familial. Margaret no longer waited for him to knock. She had handed him a small bronze key 3 days earlier with trembling fingers and the simple words, "It's late, but it's yours." Daniel had changed too. The tightness in his posture, once braced like armor, had loosened. He no longer hovered. He joined. He no longer spoke like a gatekeeper, but like someone sitting at the same table with both hands open. On that soft, overcast afternoon, Joshua had wandered into the attic with Margaret to help sort through the final boxes of Robert's things. Most of it was what one would expect: case files, clippings, old awards. But one small box caught his eye. Inside, a reel-to-reel tape labeled in Robert's precise handwriting, "For them." Joshua held it like something sacred. He and Daniel later sat in the study as Joshua slid the reel into the vintage player. The machine clicked, hissed, and then Robert's voice filled the room. "If you're hearing this, I'm gone. And maybe that's the only way I could ever say these things." Daniel froze. Joshua didn't breathe. "I loved your mother. Both of them. One held the mirror, the other held my heart. I built two lives, and in doing so, I destroyed the truth. Joshua, I saw your school recitals. I stood at the back and wept when you played with a broken wrist. Daniel, I gave you my name, but I never gave you the apology you deserved." A long pause. A deep exhale. "If you found each other, if you're listening together, then I've been given more grace than I ever earned. If music is playing between you, then the best part of me finally spoke." The recording stopped. Silence reclaimed the room. Daniel sat with his head bowed, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles turned white. When he finally spoke, his voice was a whisper. "I hated him. For a long time." Joshua nodded. "I know. I thought I had to carry the whole legacy alone. I thought the silence was a test." "It was," Joshua said softly. "But not the kind you think." Daniel turned to him, eyes bloodshot. "What do we do now?" "We finished the song," Joshua replied. "But we already did." "No," Joshua said. "I finished his part. Now we finish ours." And so, they did. Over the next several weeks, Daniel dug through boxes of old journals and scribbled melodies Robert had never developed. Joshua composed around them, blending the past with the present. Daniel wrote words, notes, thoughts, fragments of understanding and regret, and Joshua translated them into sound. They titled the piece, "For the Unspoken." When they played it for Margaret, she didn't ask questions. She simply listened with her eyes closed, tears rolling freely down her cheeks. When the final note faded, she said, "Now it sounds like all three of you." One night, Daniel gathered the reel, the letters, and the old photo of Robert holding a baby he never got to raise. He placed them in the fireplace. "I scanned them," he said. "Archived everything. But I think, this is what he'd want." Joshua stood beside him. Neither flinched as the flames consumed the paper, the tape, the secrets. "This isn't destruction," Daniel said. "It's release." The following month, they arranged a small concert in a modest hall. No banners. No fanfare. Just friends, family, and those who had once known Robert Ellison only as a stoic man of law. Now, they would hear him as something else. Daniel stepped to the microphone before the performance began. His speech was simple. "My name is Daniel Ellison. I was raised by a man I thought I knew. But tonight, I stand beside my brother. Not by blood alone, but by what we've chosen to build together." Joshua took his place at the piano. The first note rang out like a whisper, rising slowly into something whole. The melody mourned, remembered, forgave. Where once there had been silence, now there was harmony. When it ended, no one clapped. They stood. A full audience on their feet, heads bowed, hearts full. Later that evening, back at the house, the fire crackled in the hearth. Margaret poured tea. Daniel read from Robert's final journal entry. "I was afraid my truth would ruin them. But maybe truth doesn't destroy. Maybe it rebuilds, if we let it breathe." They didn't try to define what they were now. They didn't need to. Family wasn't something inherited. It was something made, note by note, word by word, moment by moment. And as Joshua placed his fingers on the keys once more, Margaret smiled and said, "Play something." He did. This time, not to grieve. Not to remember. But to begin again. And this time, he wasn't playing alone. True echo, conclusion and call to action. Some wounds are inherited. Some truths are buried. But when we find the courage to speak, to listen, and to let silence finally sing, healing becomes possible, even across generations. Joshua didn't grow up with a father. Daniel didn't grow up with the truth. But through music, both men discovered that love, though flawed and late, can still find its voice. Let this be your reminder: sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones we were never supposed to hear. If this story moved you, please like, comment, and subscribe to True Echo. Share this video with someone who needs to believe in second chances and the power of truth.